The winter had arrived in the Iron District not as a season, but as a relentless creditor, demanding a toll of breath and blood from those who possessed neither coin nor charcoal. In this corner of Ethelgard, where the fog clung to the soot-stained cobblestones like a damp shroud, Caleb Thorne stood amidst the wreckage of the morning's tide. He had reached his 19th year, yet his eyes, the cool, unblinking grey of a November sky, belonged to a man who had long ago mastered the arithmetic of despair. He did not move with the frantic, wasted energy of the newly desperate. He had learned, through 7 years of orphanhood, that energy was a currency one could ill afford to spend upon a whim. He leaned against the salt-pitted timber of a wharf, his back pressed to a stone warehouse that seemed to be holding its breath against the biting gale. His fingers, calloused and stained with the silver of fish scales, traced the familiar, jagged profile of the fish-gutting knife tucked into his belt. It was his only legacy, a bone-handled instrument that carried the scent of old brine and the weight of his father's labor. The blade was rusted at the hilt, an unforgiving sort of metal, yet the edge remained scrupulously sharp. Caleb blew upon his fingers, one by one, until they were just numb enough to hold the handle without a tremor. This was his ritual of controlled suffering, a constitutionally mandated necessity for survival, in a place where the quiet held a predatory edge. He watched the gutting tables at the edge of the docks with the intensity of a scrupulous auditor. When the heavy-set men in leather aprons threw the offal into the freezing slush of the gutter, Caleb moved. He was not fast. Speed invited the notice of the city watch or the cudgels of the warehouse guards. He was efficient. He slid between the gaps in the crowd like ink through a crack in a floorboard, his presence as unremarkable as the soot that blackened every lintel. With a rusted tool in hand, he salvaged a strip of discarded mackerel. His movements precise and practiced, he did not waste a single heartbeat. In his mind, his stomach was a ledger that refused to balance, and every scrap of oily flesh was a small, hard-won deposit against the mounting debt of his hunger. The transition from the docks to the market square was a crossing of worlds, a movement from the mausoleum of the poor to the gilded theaters of the rich. Caleb migrated to the edges of the square, choosing a vantage point behind a stack of empty wine tuns. Here the air was different. It did not smell of rotting kelp and damp slate. It bore the faint, mocking scent of roasted chestnuts, expensive bergamot, and the heavy, floral perfume of women who had never known a day without fire. Caleb sat in the lee of the barrels, invisible to the stream of silk and fur that flowed toward the grand boutiques. He watched the ankles of the gilded. It was a habit born of necessity and the rigid propriety of his station. He did not look at their faces. To meet the gaze of a nobleman was to invite a confrontation he could not afford, but he knew them by the rhythm of their movement. He counted the number of silk-clad ankles that moved past his hiding spot, timing his own shallow breaths to the rhythm of their indifference. 17 pairs of polished Hessian boots, 9 sets of delicate kid-leather slippers. They walked with the heavy, unhurried gait of those who have never seen a ledger in the red. Not one pair of boots hesitated. Not one soul looked down to see the boy, who had become a permanent fixture of the architecture, a stone that breathed. This invisibility was his shield, a tactical advantage he had honed until it was as sharp as his blade. To the wealthy, the poor were like the weather, unfortunate perhaps, but something to be endured with a closed carriage door and a turned head. Caleb felt the psychological weight of the gap between them, a chasm wider than the river that bisected the city. He was the shadow shaped like a man, the ghost at the feast of the empire. He watched a young merchant adjust a lace cuff, the man's eyes scanning the square with a gaze that skipped over every tattered coat and hollow cheek, as though they were made of glass. There was a distinct geometry to their disdain. They did not hate him. Hate required an acknowledgement of his humanity. Instead, they existed in a world where Caleb was merely part of the scenery, a smudge of charcoal on a fine silk canvas. He clutched the handle of his knife, the bone cool against his palm, and felt a simmering indignation, a cold, hard ember of resentment that he kept banked deep within his chest. He was the orphan of the Iron District, a boy who lived in the cracks of a house that was perpetually holding its breath. He knew the texture of the ice and the cost of a crust of bread, truths that the polished boots above him would never understand. He remained still, a silent witness to the arrogance of the square. unaware that the silence was about to be broken by a scream that would demand more than just his invisibility. The market square of the Iron District was a place where the social ledger was balanced daily, in favor of those with the heaviest coin, and on this particular afternoon, the air was a cold, unyielding creditor that demanded payment in bone-deep shivers. Master Barnaby Silas stood before his display of Lucchese silks, a man whose vanity was as meticulously measured as the fabric he sold. He was a creature of the nouveau riche, a silk merchant who wore his prosperity like a weapon, his frock coat of deep plum velvet serving as a barricade against the grey, damp reality of the slums. To Silas, every person who passed his stall was either a potential customer or an irritant, to be scrubbed away, and when the splash occurred, a mere spray of cold, grey sludge from a passing carriage wheel that found the polished surface of his Hessian boots. It was as if the very foundations of his world had been insulted. The woman who had accidentally caused the offense was Eleanor Valerius, though to the merchant and the gathered crowd, she was merely an elderly traveller in tattered charcoal grey wool. She had stepped back to avoid a passing cart, her foot finding a puddle, and the resulting spray had dotted the merchant's pristine footwear. Eleanor began a quiet apology, her voice possessing a rhythmic, cultivated stillness that should have signaled her true station to any observant ear. But Silas was blinded by the perceived insolvency of the situation. He did not see a lady. He saw a nuisance in rags. He stepped forward, his face contorting into a mask of performative outrage that was designed to draw the eyes of the market, ensuring that everyone witnessed his superiority. The crowd, a collection of the hungry and the weary, immediately became a mausoleum of indifference, their eyes downcast to avoid the fallout of the merchant's wrath. Master Barnaby Silas reached into his pocket and produced a handkerchief of the finest ivory silk, a lace-edged trifle that likely cost more than a labourer earned in a month. With slow, deliberate movements, he wiped the mud from his boot, his gaze fixed upon Eleanor with a sneer that was like breaking glass. Once the task was finished, he did not return the cloth to his pocket. Instead, he stepped closer to the woman, whose spine remained remarkably straight despite the cold, and with a flick of his wrist, he dropped the soiled, mud-stained silk directly onto her head. It was a gesture of profound dehumanization, a public branding of the woman as refuse, and the merchant's laugh was a dry, brittle sound that echoed against the damp slate of the surrounding buildings. Caleb Thorne watched this scene from the periphery, his grey eyes tracking the interaction with a cold, analytical precision. He was a 19-year-old orphan who had survived by mastering the architecture of invisibility, a shadow that lived on the scraps of a world that did not know his name. Hunger was his constant companion, a sharp-toothed ghost that lived in his stomach and whispered of the stale crust he had hidden in his pocket for the morrow. He had spent his life following two rigid rules: never look a noble in the eye and never intervene in a struggle that did not belong to him. Helping someone who could not pay was a luxury he could not afford. Yet as he watched the silk handkerchief flutter down onto Eleanor's silvered hair, something in the geometry of his soul shifted. The elderly woman did not cry out. She did not even reach up to remove the insult. She simply looked at Silas with eyes that held a terrifying, observant pity. It was that look, the look of a mother who had seen the worst of a child and still hoped for their soul, that shattered Caleb's resolve. It reminded him of a memory so faded, it was like a thumbprint on wet glass, a memory of warmth and safety that had no place in this soot-stained quarter. As Barnaby Silas raised his hand, his fingers curling into a fist as if to strike the woman. For her continued silence, Caleb moved. He did not run. He drifted through the crowd like a fever, his movements efficient and silent, a predator born of necessity. The merchant's hand was halfway through its arc when Caleb's fingers closed around his wrist. The contact was shocking. The calloused, ink-stained grip of a gutter-born orphan meeting the soft, pampered skin of a wealthy merchant. Master Barnaby Silas gasped, his eyes bulging as he found himself staring into the fathomless grey of Caleb's gaze. Before the merchant could summon his voice to scream for the city watch, Caleb leaned in, his face inches from the other man's ear. The smell of salt, fish guts, and the metallic tang of starvation emanated from the boy, a sensory ledger of a life Silas could never comprehend. With his other hand, Caleb drew the fish-gutting knife from his belt. It was a rusted, bone-handled thing, a tool of labor that had been sharpened into a sliver of dark intent. He did not brandish it for the crowd to see. He held it low, the point resting just above the merchant's waist, hidden by the folds of Caleb's oversized coat. The warning he whispered was so low it was almost a hum, a vibration that carried the weight of 7 years of suppressed indignation. He told the merchant that if his hand moved another inch toward the woman, the cost of his silk boots would be paid in something far more precious than coin. Barnaby Silas froze, his arrogance evaporating like steam in the winter air. He could feel the cold edge of the knife through his plum velvet, and he could feel the terrifying strength in Caleb's thin, wiry frame. For a heartbeat, the market square held its breath, the only sound, the rhythmic thudding of the merchant's panicked heart. Caleb did not blink. He was no longer a penniless orphan. He was a guardian at the threshold of a great injustice. Eleanor Valerius watched the young man with an intensity that seemed to peel away the layers of his rags and his dirt, seeing the fierce, unyielding morality that lay beneath. In that moment, the silent orphan had made a choice that would rewrite the destiny of the kingdom, though as he stood there, his thumb tracing the bone handle of his blade, his only thought was for the woman who looked like a memory. He had broken his rules. He had invited the law to hunt him, and as he prepared to drag Eleanor into the safety of the shadows, he knew that the silence of the slums would never be the same again. The roar of Master Barnaby Silas was not merely a sound. It was a violent demand for the universe to realign itself around his bruised ego. Caleb Thorne did not wait for the merchant to finish his first frantic syllable before he acted. He seized the older woman by the elbow, a gesture that, in any other circumstance, would have been a grotesque violation of propriety, and pulled her into the churning, indifferent current of the market crowd. Behind them, the voice of the merchant rose to a glass-shattering pitch, a cacophony of watch and assailant that seemed to curdle the thin, wintry air. Caleb felt the vibration of his own heart, a frantic bird trapped in the cold cage of his ribs, yet his hand remained steady. The woman, whom he knew only as Nell, moved with a surprising, almost frightening fluidity that belied her years, as they ducked behind a row of hanging tapestries that smelled of damp wool and old grease. The woman's travel-stained garment caught upon the jagged edge of a protruding brick. The sound of the fabric rending was like a sharp, agonizing intake of breath in the narrow space. Caleb glanced back, fully expecting the stutter of hesitation or the sharp cry of a lady who valued her vanity above her safety, but Eleanor Valerius did not even blink. She paid no heed to the ruined hem of her clothes. She merely adjusted her stride, the torn silk trailing behind her, like a battle-worn banner. Her endurance was not the frantic scuttling of a victim. It was the calculated, rhythmic movement of someone who understood that the geometry of the lower wards was now her only sanctuary. The cobblestones were slick with a treacherous mixture of melted sleet and industrial runoff, a dark ledger that threatened to upend their flight at every turn. Caleb navigated the corners with the visceral instinct of a creature born to the shadows, his grey eyes searching the misty morning for an exit that the city watch would not yet have occupied. He could hear the whistles now, a sharp, piercing rhythm that signaled the closing of the market gates. The law, as Caleb Thorne had come to understand it through years of starvation, was not a system of justice. It was a creditor that had come to collect a debt of blood for the simple crime of standing upright against a man with a full purse. He felt the friction of the brick walls against his shoulder as he steered Nell through a gap. So narrow they had to walk at an angle, the rough masonry scraping against their coats. They plunged deeper into the labyrinth, a network of alleyways so narrow and leaning that the sky above was reduced to a mere ribbon of bruised purple and charcoal grey. Here, the architecture was a living thing, a body of stone and timber that had grown crooked with age, neglect, and the sheer weight of the secrets it held. Caleb led the way, his feet finding purchase on bricks that other men would have found invisible or treacherous. This was his kingdom, a realm where intellectual competence was the only currency that did not devalue with the rising cost of bread. He stopped abruptly at the entrance of a passage known as the Weaver's Throat, where the floorboards were laid over a stagnant sewer, and the silence was a heavy, suffocating shroud that seemed to have teeth. "Step only where the mortar is dark and the moss is thick," Caleb whispered, his voice a low vibration that barely stirred the soot-laden air. He pointed to a specific sequence of stones that looked no different from their neighbors to the untrained eye. The rest are what the scavengers call singing bricks. They will groan under the weight of even a starving mouse, and tell every watchman within a mile precisely where we stand. To his quiet astonishment, the woman followed his instructions with a scrupulous precision that bordered on the mathematical. She did not question the grim logic of the slums. She simply observed the placement of his heels and mirrored his rhythm with a grace that spoke of a deep constitutional discipline. There was an intellectual parity in their movements, a silent conversation held through the careful shifting of weight and the shared avoidance of the singing floorboards. Caleb paused for a heartbeat to listen, straining for the distant thunder of the Iron Legion or the sharper, more erratic clatter of Silas's hired thugs. He looked at his companion in the dim, filtered light of the alley. Her face was a mask of stoic concentration, her breathing rhythmic despite the taxing pace. She did not look like a beggar, nor did she look like a victim. She looked like a woman who was conducting a thorough audit of her own survival. Caleb felt a strange, burgeoning respect for her, a sensation that was entirely foreign to a man who had spent the last 7 years viewing every human face as a potential grave. He reached out to steady her as they crossed a particularly precarious gap between two leaning tenements, where the ground had subsided into a muddy pit. For a moment, the silence between them was not a threat but a bridge. Her hand, though cold and weathered by the morning's mist, possessed a strength that suggested a soul carved from granite rather than fine china. "We are almost to the cellar," he murmured, more to anchor his own racing thoughts than to reassure her. The labyrinth seemed to hold its breath as they passed, the very walls leaning in to witness the Orphan and the hidden Duchess navigating the geometry of the dark together. Two shadows moving in a perfect, desperate synchronization. Caleb adjusted his grip on the knife, tucked into his waistband, his fingers stained with the grime of the district, but his mind as sharp as the blade itself. He knew every loose brick and every hollow echo of this place, and for the first time in his memory, his invisibility was not a curse. It was the only safety worth the name. The cellar was less a room and more a bruise upon the earth, a shallow, weeping cavity where the foundations of the forgotten neighborhood met the indifference of the river. Dampness clung to the walls like a second skin, smelling of old salt and the slow, rhythmic rot of timber that had never known the sun. Caleb Thorne sat against a jagged protrusion of stone, his breath blossoming into brief, ghost-like clouds in the stagnant air. He moved with a scrupulous economy of motion, reaching into the hidden recesses of his tattered coat to produce a small, hard object wrapped in a scrap of grey wool. It was the stale crust, a piece of rye bread so desiccated it felt more like a geological specimen than sustenance. He looked at it with a gaze that was neither hungry nor longing, but clinical, calculating the exact mathematics of survival remaining in its parched fibers. Eleanor Valerius, known to him only as Nell, sat upon a discarded crate, her spine maintaining a rectitude that even the crushing weight of the cellar's gloom could not bow. She watched him with eyes that were unnervingly sharp, capturing every tremor in his ink-stained, dirt-etched fingers. Caleb avoided meeting her gaze as he worked. He placed the crust upon a flat stone and pressed the heel of his palm against it, the sound of the bread snapping like a dry twig echoing in the silence. The silence, it seemed, had teeth. It chewed at the edges of their presence, demanding a price for their temporary sanctuary. He divided the bread unevenly, a jagged 2/3 falling to one side and a meager sliver to the other. He extended the larger portion toward her, his hand steady despite the violent protest of his own empty stomach. "Eat this," he said, his tone a hushed rasp that barely disturbed the shadows. "It is not much, but it will hold the cold at bay for an hour more." Nell looked from the bread to his face, her expression unreadable in the flickering half-light. "And what of you, Master Thorne? You have bled more than I this day, and your frame suggests a ledger that has been out of balance for a very long time." Caleb forced a short, dry sound that might have been a laugh had there been any mirth in his constitution. "I have already eaten," he lied, the words falling from his lips with the practiced ease of a man who had made a profession of invisibility. "I found a bit of salt pork near the docks before the sun turned. My belly is full enough to be an insult to the truly hungry." He watched her, his pale irises searching for any sign of doubt. The lie was his last possession, a fragile shield forged from the pride of the penniless. To offer the bread was a tactical sacrifice, a way to ensure the asset he had chosen to protect remained viable. But as the Dowager Duchess took the crust, her fingers brushed his, and the contact was like a spark struck in a dark room. The warmth of her skin was an impossible thing, a reminder of a world where bodies were not merely engines of labor or vessels for pain. Nell did not consume the bread immediately. She held it with a reverence usually reserved for the most delicate of silks, her gaze never leaving the young man who huddled in the corner. She saw the way his ribs defined the fabric of his shirt, the hollows beneath his cheekbones that looked as though they had been carved by a master of tragedies. "You are a very poor liar, Caleb Thorne," she whispered, her voice carrying a weight of authority that felt entirely out of place in a hole beneath the street. "But you are a magnificent guardian. You treat this piece of rye as though it were the crown jewels, and you treat me as though I was something worth saving." Caleb turned his face away, his jaw tightening as he stared at the slow drip of water from a rusted pipe. He had worn his isolation like weather for 19 years, and this sudden, acute observation felt like a breach in his defenses. "I treat you as a person who was being stepped on," he replied, his tone sharpening into the staccato rhythm of the streets. "In this district, you are either the boot or the mud. I have spent my life as the mud, and I found I did not care for the merchant's polish. It was a simple calculation of debt, Nell, nothing more." Instead of answering, the old woman reached out, her hand hovering for a moment before she pressed her palm against his cheek. The gesture was so unexpected, so constitutionally alien to the world of the impoverished enclave, that Caleb froze. The warmth of her hand seeped into his skin, thawing a layer of frost he had forgotten was there. For one heartbeat, perhaps two, he leaned into the touch, his eyes closing as he allowed himself to imagine a house that breathed with life instead of holding its breath in fear. It was the first parental touch he had felt since the memory of his mother had faded into a grey blur of grief. Then the realization of what he was doing struck him like a blow. He pulled away, his spine snapping straight, his expression masking the sudden terrifying vulnerability that had flared in his chest. He felt a searing heat behind his eyes, a sensation he suppressed with the iron-hard discipline of a survivor. "Do not," he whispered, the word a plea disguised as a command. "I am not a child to be comforted. I am the man who is going to get you out of this grave, and I cannot do that if I am soft." Nell withdrew her hand, but she did not look away. Her eyes held a mixture of pity and an immense, quiet pride, a look that made Caleb feel more significant than any sum of gold could ever achieve. "Tears are not forever, Caleb," she said softly, using the bread to gesture toward the darkness beyond their cellar. "But the character of a person who gives his last crumb to a stranger, that is a ledger that never fails to balance. You may think yourself a nobody, a shadow in the muck, but I see a soul that is solvent. I see a king in rags." Caleb did not answer. He took his own sliver of bread, the smaller, pathetic piece, and chewed it slowly, making it last as if it were a feast. He focused on the texture, the grit of the rye, and the way the moisture in his mouth failed to soften the hardness. He was the payment for a debt he did not owe. A sentinel standing watch over a woman whose true name would have shattered the very stones of their hiding place. Above them, the city continued its indifferent grind, unaware that in the dampest, darkest corner of its heart, a penniless orphan was teaching a duchess the true meaning of nobility. The rhythmic strike of iron-soled boots against the frost-cracked cobbles of the docklands sounded less like a march and more like the heavy, methodical beating of a drum. It was a sound that did not belong in the labyrinthine silence of the slums, a sound of order, of law, and of the sudden, sharp scent of impending consequence. Captain Marcus Sterling spared no glance for the shadows that scuttled away at his approach. He looked through them. He moved with the lethal precision of a man who had survived the scorched plains of the peninsula, his back as straight as the cold steel at his hip. Behind him, the Iron Legion flowed like a river of polished plate, their breastplates reflecting the sickly yellow glow of the street lanterns in a way that made the surrounding soot seem even darker. Sergeant Thomas Wickham, however, lacked such celestial military grace. He scurried beside the captain, his breath coming in ragged, tobacco-stained puffs that clouded the freezing air. His eyes darted toward the alleyways where he knew the easy coins were hidden, his hand resting nervously on a truncheon that had seen more use as a tool of extortion than of justice. "Captain," Wickham wheezed, struggling to match the long, disciplined strides of the soldier. The merchant Silas is in a state of high agitation. He claims a street rattar, a gut thief by the name of Caleb Thorne, assaulted him in the square. A simple matter for the watch, surely. There is no need for the Legion to disturb the delicate balance of the district for a common scuffle. Sterling did not break his stride. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon of soot-stained chimneys, dismissing the sergeant's greed with a cold, aristocratic silence. "I am not here for a merchant's bruised pride, Sergeant," he replied, his words a grim rasp that carried the weight of an absolute command. "I am here for the Golden Falcon. The order comes from the Duke himself. Until she is secured, there is no balance in this city, delicate or otherwise. Every cellar is to be turned. Every attic is to be emptied. If a single pebble is out of place, I want to know why. If your men interfere with the search for the sake of their petty bribes, I shall have them in irons before the moon sets." Wickham swallowed hard, the cold air suddenly feeling much sharper in his throat. He knew the Golden Falcon was no mere bird, but the code name for the Dowager Duchess, whose disappearance had turned the palace into a hornet's nest. The captain's systematic sweep was a machine of war being applied to a neighborhood of ghosts. The Legion moved with a scrupulous efficiency, sealing the intersections with pikes and lanterns, their presence a bright, terrifying intrusion into a world that relied on the dark to breathe. Beneath the floorboards of the damp cellar, Caleb Thorne heard the vibration before he heard the sound. It was a low hum in the marrow of his bones, a warning that the world he had spent 19 years avoiding had finally decided to acknowledge his existence. He pressed his back against the weeping stone wall, his lungs burning with the effort of remaining silent. The air in the cellar tasted of salt and ancient rot, but to Caleb, it smelled of a gallows. He reached out a hand, his fingers grazing the rough wool of the woman beside him, the one he called Nell. He wanted to tell her to be still, but she was already motionless, a statue of quiet dignity in the dark. Caleb began to count. It was a habit of the desperate, a way to measure the remaining fragments of a life that had never truly belonged to him. 100 heartbeats. 200. He watched the way the dust motes danced in the thin sliver of light from the street grate, oblivious to the storm of iron descending upon the district. He was certain, with the cold, unshakable logic of the damned, that this legion of steel had been summoned for him. He had touched a gilded, he had drawn his fish-gutting knife against a man who wore silk as a second skin. In the arithmetic of the Iron District, that was a debt that could only be settled with a noose. The irony of the situation tasted like ash in his mouth. He had spent his entire life being invisible, a shadow among shadows, surviving by the grace of his own insignificance. And yet, for a single moment of righteous indignation, for the sake of a woman who looked like she had nothing, he had summoned the full fury of the Valerius line. He wondered, with a melancholic sort of wit, if the Duke would personally watch his execution, or if he was too busy counting his own ledgers to notice the hanging of an orphan. Caleb looked at Nell's face in the gloom. She was watching him, her grey eyes reflecting the distant flicker of the soldiers' torches. There was no fear in her gaze, only a profound, quiet observation that made Caleb feel as though he were being weighed in a scale he did not understand. "They are coming," he whispered, the words barely a breath. "The Duke's men. They do not come to the Iron District for anything less than a hanging." He reached for the stale crust of bread in his pocket, the last bit of his survival, and felt a sudden sharp pang of regret. It was not regret for helping her, but for the realization that his first act of true humanity would also be his last. The absolute stillness felt dangerously feral. It gnawed at his resolve as the sound of the boots grew louder, stopping directly above their heads. Caleb braced himself, his hand closing around the hilt of his rusted knife. He was a penniless orphan, who had dared to help an old woman, and as the shadows of the Iron Legion fell across the cellar grate, he realized that being seen by the world was the one danger he should have feared above all else. He was the payment for a debt of honor he had not known he was signing, and as the latch on the cellar door began to rattle, Caleb Thorne prepared to die for the only person who had ever looked at him and seen a man instead of a ghost. The cellar was a vault of damp silence, save for the rhythmic, hollow drip of condensation sliding down the rusted iron pipes that lined the ceiling. The air here possessed a metallic tang, a thick, cloying scent of oxidized copper and wet limestone that seemed to settle in the lungs like silt. Caleb Thorne sat upon a discarded crate, his spine rigid, his posture that of someone who expected the walls themselves to turn into creditors at any moment. Across from him, the woman he knew only as Nell occupied a pile of moth-eaten sacks with a grace that the environment could not diminish. Her travel-stained cloak was a map of the city's grime, yet she sat with her hands folded in her lap, still, composed, and unnervingly observant. The winter wind whistled through the narrow street-level grate above them, carrying the faint, distant echo of a city that had forgotten their existence. Nell broke the stillness first, her voice a low, melodic chime that seemed out of place amidst the subterranean gloom. She looked at the boy, though he was more man than boy now, carved into sharp angles by the relentless masonry of poverty, and saw the way his fingers twitched near the bone handle of his knife. "You have very little, Caleb Thorne," she observed, her gaze resting briefly on the empty space where his meager meal had been moments before. A stale crust of bread, a few coins hidden in a boot, a life that requires you to be invisible to survive. Why then would you risk the only currency you possess, your safety, for a woman who could offer you nothing but a splashing of mud and a shared death in an alleyway? Caleb did not answer immediately. He looked at her with his piercing stare, the cool, unforgiving grey of a sky that had not decided whether to clear or to break into a storm. They were truth-telling eyes, stripped of the veneer of polite deception that characterized the gilded, who lived in the upper districts. To Caleb, every action was a matter of arithmetic, a ledger where the cost of a choice was measured in blood or breath. He looked at his calloused hands, stained with the soot and salt of the industrial zone, and felt the familiar, gnawing ache of a stomach that had been a void for 48 hours. "It was not for you," he said finally, his voice like the grinding of stone on stone. "Or rather, it was not only for you. Men like Barnaby Silas do not see people. They see property. They see obstacles to their own polished importance. In this district, we are the mortar between the stones, useful only so long as we are silent and unmoving. But I have watched them for years. I have watched people fade." He paused, a shadow of suppressed indignation flickering across his features. "The Iron District does not kill quickly. It is a slow-working solvent. First, it takes the luster from the eyes. Then it bleaches the memory of one's name. Finally, the body itself begins to take on the texture of the soot-stained limestone, until the person is indistinguishable from the architecture of their own misery. They simply become part of the brickwork. I decided as I saw him raise his hand that I would not let another soul be erased today." Eleanor Valerius felt a strange, cold shiver that had nothing to do with the winter draft. She had spent a lifetime surrounded by the most brilliant minds of the realm, statesmen, philosophers, and her own son, Julian, whose intellect was as sharp and as frozen as a mountain peak. Yet, none had ever described the sociology of the poor with such devastating, poetic precision. She realized then that Caleb's intervention had not been an act of impulsive gallantry. It had been a quiet, feral rebellion against a world that refused to acknowledge his humanity. He was not merely a savior, he was a witness to the invisible. She watched him as he moved to check the cellar door, his movements fluid despite the exhaustion that clearly pulled at his limbs. She saw the way he guarded the space around her, a sorrow wearing a man's coat, standing as a sentinel against a world he clearly loathed. For a moment, the impulse to reveal the truth burned in her throat. To tell him that he was protecting the Dowager Duchess, that the gilded he so despised was the very blood that flowed through her veins. She reached toward the heavy gold signet hidden beneath her glove, the falcon crest of the Valerius line pressed against her palm like a brand. The word mother echoed in her mind, a phantom sound of Julian's voice, and she imagined the Duke's reaction to this scene. Julian would see Caleb as a variable to be managed, a debt to be paid in gold and then discarded. But Eleanor saw something else, a soul whose integrity was the only solvent capable of thawing the ice that had gripped her family's house for 7 long years. If she told him now, the parity between them would shatter. He would see her as the enemy, as a statue made of the very stone that was crushing his people. He would look at her and see a grave, not a woman. Instead, she let her hand fall back into the shadows of her cloak. The secret remained a weight she would carry, a silent pact of protection for the boy's dignity. Caleb Thorne did not need a duchess. He needed the validation that his choice to be human was the correct one, regardless of the rank of the person he had saved. She watched him lean his head against the damp wall, his eyes closing for a brief, stolen second of rest. The house of his spirit was holding its breath, braced for the next blow the world would deal him, and Eleanor realized with a start that she was no longer merely observing his survival. She was invested in his triumph. "You speak of the forgotten as if you are their bookkeeper, Caleb," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the drip of the water. He opened his eyes, the grey depths searching hers for a mockery he did not find. "If the world is a ledger that must always balance, then tonight the debt is mine. And I promise you, I am a very scrupulous woman when it comes to my accounts." Caleb only grunted, a cynical sound that dismissed the possibility of repayment. He did not believe in a world where debts were paid to the invisible. He only believed in the cold, the hunger, and the knife in his hand. But as he looked at the old woman who shared his crust of bread without complaint, the ice in his own heart felt for the first time a faint and terrifying tremor of warmth. The Iron District did not merely possess shadows, it possessed depths that the sun had long ago ceased to claim. Caleb Thorne led the way into the subterranean veins of the city, where the air was thick with the effluvium of 1,000 lives lived in desperate, unwashed proximity. These tunnels were a geometry of damp brick and weeping moss, a forgotten ledger where the grand architecture of Aethelgard deposited its waste and its secrets. He moved with a scrupulous, predatory grace, his boots finding the dry edges of the stone path with the instinct of a creature born to the dark. Behind him, Dowager Duchess Eleanor Valerius followed, her travel wear utterly ruined by the grime of the descent, yet her posture remained as straight as a soldier's spear. Caleb paused at a junction where the water rushed with a hollow, hungry sound, a roar that seemed to echo the emptiness in his own stomach. He turned to look at the woman he knew only as Nell, his storm-colored eyes searching her face for the inevitable sign of disgust. He had seen it before. He had witnessed the way the well-fed reacted to the raw reality of the sewers. He expected the frantic clutching of a perfumed handkerchief to her nose, the visible shudder of a soul recoiling from the touch of the unwashed world. But Nell did not flinch. She stood amidst the damp rot and the heavy sulphurous scent of decay with an unnerving, statuesque stillness. She did not cover her face. She did not treat the air he breathed as a poison to be avoided. Instead, she looked at the moss-slicked walls and the black water with a quiet, observant dignity, acknowledging the environment not as a horror to be shunned, but as the sanctuary it currently provided. It was a recognition that pierced Caleb more sharply than any insult Master Silas could have hurled. A silent admission that his world, however grim and forgotten, was worthy of being seen without a mask. The unspoken understanding between them possessed a razor edge, biting through the layers of social propriety that should have kept them a universe apart. The descent continued, the tunnels narrowing, until the ceiling felt like a weight pressing against their very thoughts. Caleb felt the house of the city breathing above them, a heavy, rhythmic pulse of carriage wheels and commerce that felt entirely alien to the cold stone beneath their feet. He watched Nell carefully, noting the way she stepped over the debris of the slums without a word of complaint. She moved as if she had walked these catacombs before, or perhaps as if her internal constitution was made of a granite that no amount of filth could erode. The silence of the tunnels was suddenly punctured by the rhythmic, metallic strike of iron-shod boots against the stone above, a sound that Caleb recognized as the language of authority, but it was the sound from within the tunnel, a coarse, phlegmatic cough followed by the scraping of a lantern's shutter that froze the marrow in his bones. Sergeant Thomas Wickham was not a man of great ambition, but he possessed a predatory nose for the scent of a merchant's bribe. He was a man who viewed the law as a ledger to be balanced in his own favor, and Caleb knew that Master Silas would have paid a handsome sum to see the orphan who had dared to defy him brought to heel. Caleb pressed himself and Nell into the shallow, frigid alcove of a bricked-up ventilation shaft. The darkness here was absolute, smelling of wet slate and old iron. Wickham's voice rumbled through the passage, thick with the laziness of a guard who preferred the comfort of a tavern to the damp of a chase. He was speaking to a subordinate, his words dripping with a casual cruelty that made Caleb's hand tighten on the bone hilt of his fish-gutting knife. They were searching for the vagrant and the hag, their voices echoing with the hollow arrogance of those who believed themselves the masters of the unseen. The lantern light flickered across the damp walls, creeping closer to their hiding spot like a searching finger of fire. Caleb felt the weight of the 3 copper pieces in his pocket. The stale crust was gone, and these coins were his only remaining anchor to the world of the living. They were the result of a month's worth of back-breaking labor at the salt docks, the price of several days of bread, and perhaps the meager start of a new life in a different district. To Caleb, they were not merely metal, they were time, effort, and the very blood of his survival. The light was only yards away, illuminating the greasy sheen on the tunnel floor. Caleb did not hesitate, though the choice felt like a physical wound. He drew the coins from his pocket and threw them with a practiced, desperate flick of his wrist down the intersecting tunnel to the left. The sound of the copper striking the wet stone was a clear, ringing note in the heavy atmosphere. A siren's song for a man of Wickham's insatiable avarice. The sergeant's footsteps immediately shifted, the promise of a stray coin overriding the duty of the hunt. "Did you hear that, boy?" Wickham grunted, his voice sharpening with greed. The rats dropped his stash. As the lantern light receded into the distance, following the false trail of Caleb's future, the young man felt a sudden cold vacuum where his hope had been. He had purchased their safety with the only currency he possessed. He turned to Nell in the darkness, his face a mask of iron-hard resolve, and gestured for her to follow. The way to the clock tower was now clear. But he had walked into the shadows as a man with a future, and was emerging as a man with nothing but a debt to a stranger. He had worn his poverty like weather for 19 years. But tonight, the storm had finally taken everything but his pride. The ascent into the hollowed-out skeleton of the old clock tower was a vertical pilgrimage through layers of rot and cold iron. Caleb Thorne led the way, his boots finding the precise points of the stone's steps that would not crumble under a man's weight. He never glanced behind to see if the woman followed. He simply reached back a hand, calloused and stained by the residue of the docks, to guide her through the pockets of absolute darkness. The air within the tower smelled of ancient grease, damp stone, and the metallic tang of unmoving gears, a scent that had become his only inheritance. The tower was not merely a structure to him. It was a living body that had long ago ceased to breathe, its mechanical heart stalled by decades of neglect. When they reached the small, precarious ledge he called home, the wind from the district below howled through the unglazed apertures like a creditor demanding payment. Caleb did not complain. He moved with a scrupulous efficiency, lighting a single tallow stub that flickered against the damp slate walls. The room was sparse, a landscape of survival. A pile of moth-eaten blankets, a single wooden stool, and a small clay jar that held his most precious possession. In this bleak ward, gold was a luxury, but clean water was a miracle. Dowager Duchess Eleanor Valerius sank onto the stool with a dignity that even rags could not diminish. She did not wince as she inspected the jagged scrape along her forearm, a souvenir from their flight through the labyrinthine alleys. Caleb Thorne knelt before her, his ashen gaze, the cool, truth-telling grey of a winter sky, fixed on the wound. He reached for the clay jar. His own throat felt as though it were lined with dry slate, his tongue heavy with the salt of his day's labor and the dust of the streets. Every instinct of survival screamed at him to drink, to preserve the liquid for the 3 days of heat and thirst that would surely follow this winter snap. Instead, he dipped a scrap of relatively clean linen into the jar. He was constitutionally incapable of seeing a vulnerability and not attempting to mend it, a trait that had kept him penniless while others of his station grew fat on theft. He began to wash the grit from her skin. The water was cold, yet he moved with a tenderness that seemed out of place in a youth who gut fishes for a living. Each drop he spilled onto the cloth was a sacrifice, a choice to prioritize the comfort of this stranger over the fundamental requirements of his own body. He did not consider himself a hero. He merely calculated that her need was greater than his own arithmetic of suffering. The muted atmosphere within the room carried a distinct menace. It bit into the awareness of their proximity. Eleanor watched him, her gaze sharp and psychologically acute. She noted the way his hands did not shake despite his obvious exhaustion. She saw the ink-stained tips of his fingers, a remnant of some past effort at literacy that the world had tried to scrub away. To the rest of the city, he was an invisible orphan, a shadow draped in an oversized coat. To her, he was becoming the first honest room she had entered in years. Caleb fastened the damp cloth around her arm with a strip of threadbare ribbon. "It is not much," he whispered, his voice hoarse from the cold. "But it will keep the fever at bay. You should rest. The city watch does not climb this high. They are too fond of their heavy boots and their soft beds." He offered her the last of the water in the jar, a gesture of absolute surrender to his role as her protector. He did not expect her gratitude. In his world, kindness was usually a prelude to a trap, and he wanted her to know that here, in the cold heart of the tower, there were no teeth in the shadows. As the tallow candle burned lower, the moonlight began to bleed through the high, arched windows of the clock face, casting long, geometric shadows across the floor. The Dowager Duchess Eleanor Valerius leaned back against the cold stone wall, her breath visible in the freezing air. She reached up to adjust the fit of her heavy, travel-worn glove, a garment that had seen better decades. For a moment, the fabric snagged against the rough surface of her ring, and she was forced to peel the leather back to free it. There, in the sudden, silver clarity of the moon, the Valerius signet ring caught the light. It was a heavy thing of ancient gold, its surface scarred by the passage of time, but its essence undiminished. The crest of the falcon, the symbol of a house that had stood since the foundations of the kingdom were laid, glowed like a beacon. It was an object of immense gravity, a piece of the world that Caleb Thorne lived beneath, a world of ledgers, titles, and iron-hard propriety. Caleb was busy at the other end of the room, bracing the door with a length of timber. He did not see the flash of the aristocratic sun in his darkened sanctuary. He did not see the way Eleanor's fingers curled instinctively over the gold, hiding the secret of her birth back beneath the anonymity of the glove. The dramatic irony hung in the air like the smell of an approaching storm. He treated her as a grandmother of the gutters, a woman of no account, unaware that the hand he had just washed with his last drop of water held the power to raise him to the heights of the palace, or crush him into the dust of the Iron District. Eleanor watched him move through the shadows, her expression unreadable. She felt the weight of the signet against her skin, a cold, metallic reminder of her duty and her debt. She had stepped out of her carriage to see if the city she loved still possessed a soul, and she had found it in a boy who owned nothing but a rusted knife and a sense of integrity that put the entire House of Lords to shame. The house of her own heart, which had been holding its breath for so long, began to exhale. She realized then that being seen by the right person was not the danger. It was the only safety worth the name. Caleb Thorne looked at her and saw a human being in need of warmth, not a title in need of a bow. He was scrupulous in his care, treating her with a dignity that was not mandated by law, but by a higher, unwritten code of the spirit. The silence in the tower was no longer threatening. It was the quiet of a sanctuary where the architecture of a soul was finally being acknowledged. Caleb finished his work at the door and turned back, his face a mask of weary resolve. "I will keep watch by the gears," he said, his voice level. "If the merchant's men find the base of the tower, they will have to contend with the machinery before they reach you. Sleep now, Nell. Tomorrow, the sun will decide what we are to do." He retreated into the darkness near the great pendulum, leaving her in the pool of moonlight. Eleanor Valerius watched him go, the falcon on her finger pressing into her palm like a promise. She knew that her son, Duke Julian Valerius, would be tearing the city apart by now, his grief disguised in noble clothing as he searched for his vanished mother. But for this night, she was simply Nell, the guest of a penniless orphan who was, quite unknowingly, the wealthiest man she had ever met. The tower stood silent, its gears waiting for a hand to turn them, while the world outside continued its frantic, blind search for a woman who was already exactly where she needed to be. Across the Iron District, Master Barnaby Silas sat in a chamber that smelled of cedar, expensive beeswax, and a particularly malignant form of self-importance. To the casual observer, the room was a sanctuary of success, lined with ledgers and heavy mahogany furniture that had been polished until it gleamed like dark water. However, to Barnaby, the space felt increasingly small, crowded by the echoing memory of the market square. The sound of his own authority being snapped like a dry twig by a nameless orphan in a fish-stained coat. He was a man who calculated the world in precise measurements of silk and satin, a man who believed that the texture of one's life was determined entirely by the cost of one's boots. To have those boots splattered with common mud by an old hag was an annoyance. To have his wrist seized by a boy who did not even possess the dignity of a last name was an existential threat. The merchant's anger was not a sudden explosion, but a cold, steady accumulation of debt. He viewed the insult as a ledger that remained dangerously unbalanced. Across from him, standing on an antique rug that cost more than a laborer earned in 3 years, was Old Man Garrett. The scavenger was a stark contrast to the room's refinement. A creature of grey skin and yellowed teeth, who seemed to carry the very dampness of the working-class maize in the folds of his grease-stained wool. Barnaby did not look at the man directly. He looked instead at the heavy purse of silver sitting on the desk between them, the coins clinking with a sound that was both musical and lethal. It was not merely the return of the old woman that Barnaby Silas demanded. His voice, when he finally spoke, was clipped and precise, the voice of an official conducting a scrupulous audit of a failing business. He instructed Garrett that the boy, the one with the grey eyes that looked through people rather than at them, was the primary target. Barnaby's obsession focused on the hand that had dared to touch his fine wool sleeve. He insisted that when the boy was found, his hands were to be rendered useless, a specific and permanent punishment for the audacity of his intervention. The merchant wanted Caleb Thorne to spend the rest of his miserable life as a visible reminder of what happened to those who forgot the geometry of social standing. Barnaby's rage had become a weather system in the room, a heavy, airless pressure that demanded a sacrifice. He did not care for the old woman's identity. To him, she was merely the catalyst for the orphans' rebellion, a tattered scrap of human debris that deserved to be swept away, along with the boy who had chosen to defend her. Old Man Garrett listened with the stillness of a predator that had spent decades waiting in the shadows of the city's lower half. He did not ask for reasons, nor did he offer sympathy. He only saw the silver and the opportunity to exert power over a district that usually ignored him. When he finally reached for the purse, his fingers were calloused and black-rimmed with filth, a sight that made Barnaby's lip curl in a momentary spasm of disgust. But the merchant tolerated the proximity of the scavenger because Garrett was the only tool sharp enough to cut through the labyrinth of the slums. As the two men finalized the arrangement, the house itself seemed to hold its breath, the heavy velvet curtains muffling the sounds of the street as if the very walls were complicit in the coming violence. The hunt began not with a shout, but with the patient, rhythmic scraping of boots against damp slate. Old Man Garrett moved through the shadowed streets with a terrifying familiarity, his band of thugs trailing behind him like a pack of lean, hungry curs. They did not search for the boy's face. They searched for the scent of something that did not belong in the rot and the misery of the back alleys. Caleb Thorne had been careful, navigating the sewers and the shifting shadows with the skill of a ghost, but he had underestimated the betrayal of luxury. As the group approached the base of the ancient, hollowed-out clock tower, Garrett stopped, his head tilting like a hound catching a faint trail on a shifting wind. The smog-choked sector was a place of iron, grease, and the smell of roasting mutton that one could never quite afford. It was not a place for fine, imported silk. Garrett knelt by a rusted gear that had fallen from the tower's skeleton years ago, its jagged edges catching the pale, winter moonlight. There, snagged on a burr of oxidized metal, was a single thread of gold. It was a minute thing, no longer than a fingernail, but it shimmered with a defiant, aristocratic light against the grey stone. It was a thread from the lining of Nell's travel pelisse, a garment that was tattered but made of a weave so superior it stood out in the slums like a diamond in a coal scuttle. Garrett picked the thread up with a mocking grin, rolling the expensive fibre between his dirty thumb and forefinger. He leaned in and inhaled, a long, exaggerated draw of breath that seemed to pull the very soul out of the surrounding air. He let out a low, raspy chuckle that sounded like stones grinding together in a dry well. There was a rich smell here, he remarked to his men, a scent of lavender, aged paper, and the kind of security that only comes from centuries of owning the land one walked upon. It was a smell that had no business being in a tomb of dead machinery. The clock tower loomed above them, a skeletal finger pointing toward a sky the color of a fresh bruise. To the thugs, it was a derelict ruin, but to Garrett, the presence of that gold thread transformed the tower into a cage. He looked up at the darkened windows of the upper levels, knowing that the boy and the old woman were somewhere within the grinding heart of the gears. The stillness of the slums, which usually felt heavy and empty, suddenly took on a menacing bite. Garrett began to climb the first set of rotted wooden stairs, his movements deliberate and devoid of haste. He knew they had no other exit. He knew that the boy's grey eyes would soon be filled with the realization that in this city, even the smallest act of kindness carried a debt that the poor could never hope to pay. Each footfall on the stairs was a drumbeat of approaching judgment, and the tower, sensing the intrusion of such sharp-edged intent, seemed to groan in its ancient sleep. The air inside the tower was a ledger of cold iron and stagnant grease, a vertical mausoleum, where time was measured in the rhythmic grinding of brass. Caleb Thorne moved through the shadows, with a predatory economy of motion that the streets of the ragged quarter had carved into his very marrow. Below him, the rhythmic crunch of boots upon the frozen slush grew more distinct, a sound like dry bone snapping under a heavy, indifferent tread. He did not possess the luxury of fear. Years of hollowed-out hunger had long ago consumed the space where terror might have resided, leaving only the sharp, crystalline clarity of a man who possessed nothing but his integrity and a rusted blade. The great gears of the tower groaned above him, their slow, methodical rotation serving as a heartbeat for a city that did not care if he lived or perished. He reached into the pocket of his threadbare coat and withdrew a small, jagged piece of lead, a scrap salvaged from a ruined gutter during a winter that had been more of a creditor than a season. He knew the geometry of this mechanical sanctuary better than he knew the lines of his own palms. The hush held a savage promise, and Caleb intended to weaponize it against the coming intrusion. To allow the clock to continue its rhythmic tolling was to provide a metronome for his executioners, a steady signal that would guide Old Man Garrett's thugs through the gloom. He climbed the iron rungs of the maintenance ladder, his fingers callosed and stained with the residue of 1,000 desperate labors, finding the exact point where the primary escapement met the driving wheel. The smell of oxidized copper and ancient oil rose to meet him. With a grunt of effort that he refused to let escape his lips, Caleb wedged the lead into the teeth of the mechanism. The machinery shuddered. A groan of protesting metal vibrated through the floorboards, a dying sigh from a mechanical giant, and then the ticking stopped. The sudden absence of sound was a physical weight, a pressure that pressed against his eardrums and made the darkness feel more absolute. He stood in the stillness, his steely eyes, the truth-telling features that had seen too much and blinked too little, and scanning the narrow entrance far below, he drew the fish-gutting knife. The rusted, bone-handled blade caught the sliver of moonlight that managed to pierce through the high, arched windows. It was a humble weapon, a tool of the invisible class. Yet in the weighted silence of the tower, it felt like an extension of his own defiant will. He was no longer merely a penniless orphan scavenging for survival. He had become the master of this vertical graveyard, and anyone who sought to harm the woman hidden in its shadows would have to account for every day of his survival. The winter wind howled against the stone exterior, but inside, the air was as static as a held breath. Dowager Duchess Eleanor Valerius stood in the center of the gear room, her spine as straight as a palace column, despite the damp rot that permeated the atmosphere. Caleb Thorne looked at her, and for a fleeting second, he saw not a beggar woman in tattered travel clothes, but a figure of immense, unyielding dignity who seemed to command the very shadows. He did not know that she was the mother of a duke, nor did he realize that her absence was currently tearing the city apart. He knew only that she had looked at him with kindness when the world had offered only a sneer. He moved toward her, his footsteps making no sound on the oil-slicked wood. The darkness was a shroud they both wore, a shared garment of the forgotten. He reached out and grasped her hand, guiding her toward the massive, obsidian-like shadow of the primary pendulum, a heavy, brass-faced weight that hung like a guillotine blade in the gloom. Hide behind this stone pier, Caleb whispered, speaking in a gravelly murmur that barely stirred the dust motes. Do not move, regardless of the sounds that follow. If the gears begin to turn again, stay clear of the teeth, for they do not distinguish between silk and wool. He reached into his belt and pulled free a heavy iron clock tower key, an ancient, pitted object that had once belonged to the primary gate. It was nearly the length of his forearm and weighed as much as a small cudgel. He pressed it into her palms, his calloused skin brushing against her soft, weathered hands. It was the first time he had ever touched another human with such deliberate protective care, an act of arming her for a battle he hoped she would never have to fight. If I fall, use this. Aim for the throat or the temple. Do not hesitate, for they will not. Nell looked down at the iron key, and then back at the young man who stood before her. Her eyes were not filled with the frantic bird-like panic he had expected. Instead, they held a profound, terrifyingly calm observation that seemed to read the ledger of his life in a single glance. She seemed to be measuring the architecture of his soul against the grim reality of their situation, calculating the debt he was prepared to pay for her safety. You would die for a stranger who has given you nothing but the burden of her company and a shared piece of stale bread, she said softly. It was not a question, but a statement of moral fact that Caleb found difficult to meet. He turned his gaze back to the trapdoor. The first wave of the thugs had reached the lower levels. He could smell the acrid smoke of their tallow torches and the sour stench of unwashed wool and malevolence. They were coming, not for gold, but for the pride of a boy who had dared to speak to a nobody as though she were a queen. He braced his feet against the floorboards, his rusted weapon held low and ready. The house was holding its breath. The machinery of the great clock did not merely mark time. It seemed to consume it, swallowing the seconds with a rhythmic, metallic hunger that vibrated through the very marrow of Caleb Thorne's bones. He stood amidst the skeletal remains of the tower's clockwork, his silver-grey gaze narrowed against the flickering torchlight that bled up from the stairs. He was a creature of the shadows, a sorrow wrapped in a thin, ragged coat, but tonight his posture was dictated by a new, heavy sort of propriety. Behind him, hidden within the labyrinth of brass pendulums and iron counterweights, sat the woman he knew only as Nell. She was the first person in his 19 years of invisibility who had looked at him and seen something other than a grave, and that recognition was a debt he intended to settle with his life. Old Man Garrett was the first to crest the final landing, his silhouette a jagged tear against the orange glow. He was followed by 3 others, men whose souls were as rusted as the blades they carried. Garrett did not offer the mercy of silence. His laugh was a grating sound, like iron dragging over dry stone. He looked at Caleb, who was malnourished and trembling from a caloric deficit that had lasted for days, and he saw only a feast for the crows. He did not see the scrupulous arithmetic of a man who had nothing left to lose. Caleb did not wait for the inevitable descent. He moved with a feral, unpolished grace, his hand tightening around the bone handle of his humble dagger. It was an honest tool, stained with the viscera of 1,000 bottom feeders, and in this frozen chamber, it became a scepter of his defiance. The first thug lunged, a broad-shouldered scavenger who relied on the blunt force of his momentum. Caleb Thorne did not attempt a graceful parry. He had neither the strength for a prolonged duel nor the luxury of space. Instead, he made a calculated sacrifice, a trade recorded in the grim ledger of his survival. He leaned into the man's strike, allowing the dull blade to bite deep into the meat of his left shoulder. The pain arrived not as a shock, but as a cold, sharpening clarity. As the thug's weight committed to the blow, Caleb dropped low, the iron teeth of the floor gears humming inches from his ear. He drove the rusted steel upward, targeting the man's thigh with the surgical precision of a butcher. The man collapsed with a strangled cry, his leg buckling as the bone-handled blade found its mark, and Caleb was already pivoting toward the next shadow before the first had even hit the floor. Old Man Garrett did not flinch at the sight of his man's fall. He merely stepped over the writhing body, his eyes fixed on the narrow exit that led to the upper reaches of the tower where Nell was concealed. The air in the chamber grew thick with the smell of old grease, salt blood, and the metallic tang of the winter wind that whistled through the gaps in the masonry. Caleb felt the heat of his own blood soaking through his thin tunic, a warm, crimson creditor claiming its due, but his spine remained an iron rod. He was the only barrier between the world's cruelty and the woman who had shared her silence with him. Every strike he took was a conscious choice, an intellectual parity established through violence. He was measuring his own endurance against the thug's greed, and the numbers, he realized, were beginning to favor the desperate. The second and third thugs closed in simultaneously, their movements dictated by the cramped geometry of the gears. Caleb Thorne used the very house against them. The tower, after all, was a living body of stone and metal that he had inhabited for years. He ducked beneath a swinging lead weight, the massive pendulum whispering past his hair like the breath of a god. One man tripped over a protruding iron rod Caleb had intentionally loosened months ago, and as the scavenger stumbled, Caleb delivered a sharp, staccato kick to the man's temple. But the exertion was a heavy tax on a body that had survived on a stale crust of rye bread. His vision flickered, the edges of the room blurring into a grey fog, and in that momentary lapse, Old Man Garrett found his opening. Garrett moved with a speed that belied his age, his calloused hands catching Caleb Thorne by the throat and slamming him against the cold, unyielding granite of the central pillar. The impact rattled the gears in Caleb's mind, the rhythmic ticking of the clock suddenly sounding like the heavy footfalls of an approaching executioner. He was pinned, his feet dangling inches above the floor, the pressure on his windpipe turning the world a bruised shade of purple. Garrett's face was inches from his own, the smell of cheap ale and rot pouring from the man's mouth. Caleb's fingers sought the bone handle of his knife, but it had slipped from his grasp during the collision. He was unarmed, his strength fading, as the creditor of his hunger finally came to collect the total sum. Yet, even as the darkness pressed inward, Caleb did not look away. He could feel Nell watching from the shadows. He could sense the stillness of her presence, the way she seemed to hold her breath in tandem with the tower itself. He refused to die quietly. He refused to let the exit be breached. As Garrett's fingers tightened, threatening to crush the very instrument of Caleb's voice, the boy found one last reservoir of animalistic will. He did not plead for mercy was a currency the slums did not recognize. Instead, he lunged forward with his head, catching Garrett off guard, and sunk his teeth into the meat of the man's hand with a savage, unrelenting force. It was a desperate, feral act of protection, a physical manifestation of his refusal to yield the threshold. Garrett roared in agony, his grip loosening just enough for Caleb Thorne to slide down the stone pillar, his lungs drawing in a ragged, burning gulp of the freezing air. The man pulled back, staring at his bloodied hand with a mixture of shock and burgeoning fury. But Caleb was already bracing himself against the exit. He was a broken thing, a collection of bruises and shallow breaths, but he remained the master of that narrow doorway. He looked at Garrett through a veil of his own sweat and blood, his grey eyes shining with an intellectual spark that the thug leader could not comprehend. Caleb Thorne was no longer just an orphan scavenging for fish guts. He was a sentinel, and the house he defended was no longer a hollow shell, but a sanctuary. He waited for the next blow, his heart beating a frantic counter-rhythm to the great clock, unaware that the sound of armored boots was already beginning to drown out the mechanical ticking of the tower. Duke Julian Valerius rode as if the very hounds of hell were at his heels, though in truth, the only demon pursuing him was the silent, gnawing dread that had hollowed out his chest for the last 7 hours. The lower city did not welcome visitors of his station. It was a place of soot and secrets, where the shadows possessed a physical weight, and the air smelled of wet slate and rancid tallow. To a man who managed his vast ancestral estates with the cold, scrupulous precision of an audit, this urban chaos was more than an inconvenience. It was a visceral affront to the order he represented. He had worn his grief like weather for 7 years, a static coldness that had defined his life since his father's passing. But today, that ice had shattered into 1,000 jagged shards of panic. Captain Marcus Sterling, a man whose weathered skin bore the map of the Peninsular War in a dozen faded scars, rode at the Duke's left flank. The horse's hooves sparked against the uneven, muck-slicked cobbles, a rhythmic dissonance that echoed through the narrow, suffocating alleys. "Your Grace," Sterling cautioned, his warning a gruff whisper that barely carried over the whistling wind. "This is not the terrain for a frontal assault. These streets are a maze designed to swallow men of our breeding. Let the scouts sift through the dregs first. Julian did not look at him. His grey eyes, the color of a winter sea just before the arrival of a gale, remained fixed on the skeletal frame of the ancient clock tower that loomed like a rotting sentinel over the district. The cold was a creditor Julian could not pay, a mounting debt of guilt that threatened to bankrupt his soul if he arrived too late. "My mother is somewhere in this rot, Marcus," the Duke replied, his voice clipped and iron-hard, stripped of all aristocratic ornament. "If the crown requires a duke tonight, it shall find one carved from the marrow of this district. We do not wait for scouts when the Valerius blood is in peril." The sound reached them then, a sharp metallic clashing that cut through the low ambient moan of the city's winter wind. It was the unmistakable sound of a struggle, the rhythmic strike of steel against iron that signaled a man fighting for his life. It was a sound that Julian felt in the very architecture of his bones. Without waiting for the Iron Legion to form a proper perimeter, he spurred his mount forward into a gallop. The horse, a massive black beast bred for the charge, thundered through the market square, scattering the few remaining scavengers like dry leaves before a storm. The Duke's cloak billowed behind him like a funeral shroud, a dark blur of silk and purpose. The Iron Legion followed, a phalanx of silent, armored men who moved with the mathematical certainty of a ledger being balanced. There were no shouts, no frantic orders. There was only the mechanical thud of boots and the ominous creak of leather. They were the Duke's personal instrument of justice, men who viewed the world through the same lens of duty and debt as their master. As they reached the base of the clock tower, Julian dismounted before his horse had even fully halted, his boots hitting the frozen mud with a sound like a gavel. The building seemed to be holding its breath, a mausoleum of gears and lost time. The breathless pause in the tower felt razor-sharp, cutting as it stretched between them. The wood splintered with a sound like a struck bell, the echoes vibrating through the hollow chest of the structure. Julian was the first through the breach, his own blade drawn, a sliver of polished, unforgiving light in the gloom of grease and rust. The interior was a labyrinth of shadows, illuminated only by the flickering, sickly orange light of a dying lamp somewhere above. The air was thick with the tang of copper and the heavy cloying scent of coal oil. Inside, the scene was one of feral desperation meeting absolute power. Old Man Garrett and his band of thugs were frozen in the half-light, their faces pale masks of sudden, visceral terror. They were the predators of the slums, men who lived by the blade and the blunt instrument. But, in the presence of the Duke and his Iron Legion, they were reduced to the status of vermin. The thugs looked at their own rusted knives and then at the pristine cold steel of the soldiers, and the realization of their insignificance was a physical blow. One man, his eyes wide with a coward's panic, dropped his weapon before a hand was even laid upon him. Old Man Garrett, sensing the change in the atmosphere, the sudden shift from a hunt to an execution, attempted to slink into the shadows behind a massive rusted pendulum. But the Duke's presence was a vacuum that drew all light and hope toward it. Julian's gaze swept the room, not with anger but with a terrifying intellectual detachment. He saw the thugs not as men, but as obstacles to be removed from the ledger of his life. "Secure the perimeter," Julian commanded, the words echoing through the gear-choked chamber. "And if any hand is raised against the Legion, see that it is the last thing they ever raise." The Legion moved with lethal precision, subduing the thugs without a wasted heartbeat. Captain Sterling led the charge up the first flight of stairs, his heavy boots sounding like the tolling of a doom bell. The thugs who dared to resist were met with the silent, crushing efficiency of professional soldiers who had seen far worse than a street brawl. Garrett was pinned against a stone pillar by 2 legionnaires, his whimpering pleas for mercy ignored by men who valued character over words. The hierarchy of the slums had been overturned in a single violent stroke of aristocratic will. Julian did not stop to watch the subduing of the criminals. His focus was upward, toward the high platform, where the great gears groaned like a dying beast. He could hear the shallow, rattling breath of someone who had reached the limit of their endurance, and beneath it a soft, steadying voice that he would recognize even in the deepest silence of the grave. His heart, which had been a frozen stone for 7 years, began to thaw with a pain so acute it nearly stole his breath. He took the stairs 3 at a time, the weight of his title and his duty finally giving way to the simple, desperate need of a son. He was a sorrow wearing a man's coat, but for the first time in nearly a decade, the man beneath was starting to breathe. The heavy oak doors of the gear room did not merely open, they surrendered under the absolute authority of the Crown. Caleb Thorne did not have the luxury of fear, for fear requires the breath he no longer possessed. His lungs were a forge of iron and ash, and his heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of his ribs. He braced his shoulder against the primary axle of the great clock, feeling the rhythmic, indifferent pulse of the machine through his marrow. The fish-gutting knife, rusted and slick with the copper smell of his own exertion, felt like a heavy anchor in his hand. His legs were shaking so violently that he had to lean his weight against the cold brass gears to remain upright. Yet his grip on the bone handle remained scrupulous. The man who stepped through the splintered threshold was not a merchant or a common thug. He moved with the terrifying stillness of a winter storm, a sorrow wearing a man's coat. His eyes were the cool grey of a sky that has not decided whether to clear, and they swept the room with the efficiency of a predator counting its kill. Caleb did not know this man, but he recognized the architecture of power in the set of his shoulders and the gold embroidery upon his collar. He knew, with a clarity that only arrives at the edge of a grave, that this was the final creditor come to collect the debt of his life. He forced his legs to lock, even as his vision blurred at the edges from the caloric deficit of the last 2 days. He stood between the stranger and the dark alcove where Nell waited, the woman who had shared his bread, the woman who had looked at him and seen something other than a shadow. His jagged implement remained level, a horizontal line of rebellion drawn in the dark. It was a pathetic gesture, a sliver of iron against a mountain of steel, yet he held it with a grim propriety. He was a nobody, a penniless orphan whom the world had spent 19 years trying to erase, but in this one room he was the master of a single holy duty. Julian Valerius halted. The Duke did not reach for his own weapon. He simply stared at the boy who looked like a collection of bruises held together by sheer irrational defiance. Julian's gaze dropped to the pathetic blade, then back to Caleb's grey eyes, eyes that told the truth of every hunger and every blow he had ever endured. The Duke had worn his grief like weather for 7 years, but as he looked at the starving boy, defending a beggar woman, the frost in his own soul began to crack with a sound like a struck bell. "Step away from her," Julian commanded, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle the very floorboards. He did not shout. Men of his stature had no need for such vulgarities. His presence dominated the space, a physical weight that made the air itself feel thick and difficult to navigate. Behind him, the iron-shod boots of the Iron Legion rang out on the stone stairs, a rhythmic announcement of an approaching storm that Caleb Thorne could not possibly survive. "I will not," Caleb whispered, the words rattling in a throat filled with the dust of the tower. He did not care about titles, or the soldiers filling the staircase. He only knew that for the first time in his life, he was the only safety worth the name for another human being. He did not recognize the Duke, saw only another powerful man come to stomp upon the forgotten. The fish-gutting knife remained level, a horizontal line of rebellion drawn in the dark. Then, the shadow behind the gears moved. Nell stepped out from the darkness of the alcove. She completely ignored the soldiers and the swords. Her travel clothes were torn, her grey hair was escaping its pins, and her hands were stained with the same oil that marked Caleb's skin. But as she moved into the circle of lantern light, the air in the room seemed to change its constitution. It grew heavy with a dignity that had nothing to do with silk and everything to do with the iron core of her spirit. She looked only at the boy who had bled for her. Julian Valerius did not strike. He did not argue. The Duke of Aethelgard, the most formidable man in the kingdom, simply collapsed. He dropped to one knee upon the dusty floor, his forehead bowing low as his pride shattered. "Mother," he choked out, the words sounding like a prayer whispered in a mausoleum. The soldiers of the Iron Legion froze, their weapons lowered in an instant of profound shock as they witnessed the absolute surrender of their commander. Caleb's arm went numb. The makeshift dagger slipped from his fingers, clattering against the stone. A small, sharp sound in the vastness of the revelation. He looked from the kneeling Duke to the old woman, his mind attempting to perform the impossible arithmetic of this reality. Nell, the beggar woman who had eaten his hard rye crust in a damp cellar, the Dowager Duchess Eleanor Valerius. The mute shock in the room was practically carnivorous, and it was devouring his understanding of the world. Eleanor did not direct her eyes to her son first. She did not rush to the Duke or weep over his rescue, though the relief on her face was as clear as a morning sky. Instead, she turned to Caleb Thorne. She reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder, the same shoulder that was soaked in the blood of his defense. Her touch was not the delicate gesture of a noblewoman, but the firm, grounding weight of a mother acknowledging a son. Beneath her glove, the Valerius signet ring caught the light, the heavy gold falcon a silent witness to the change in the ledger of his life. In that moment she signaled to every soldier in the room, and to the Duke himself, where her loyalty had been forged. She chose the orphan over the palace, the protector over the power. The house, it seemed, was no longer holding its breath, it was finally exhaling. Eleanor looked down at her kneeling son, her voice ringing with the clarity of a bell. "Stand up, Julian," she said firmly, "and look at this man. He is the only one in your city who looked at me and saw a person, rather than a price. He is the one who fed me when I was hungry and guarded my life when the world you rule had turned its back." The interior of the clock tower was no longer a sanctuary of shadows and grinding brass. It had become a court of iron and silent, devastating judgment. Duke Julian Valerius stood in the center of the chamber, his presence so absolute that the very air seemed to thicken with the weight of his authority. Beside him, Dowager Duchess Eleanor Valerius stood with a quiet, terrifying grace, her hand resting lightly on the boy's trembling shoulder. At the threshold of the room, flanked by 2 soldiers of the Iron Legion, whose armor gleamed like cold mirrors, stood Master Barnaby Silas. The merchant's silk coat, once the pride of his vanity, was now torn and spattered with the filth of the very alleys he had looked upon with such disdain. His face was the color of curdled cream, and a profound constitutional tremor had taken possession of his frame. Julian did not shout. His voice was a low, resonant chime, far more lethal than any scream of rage. He looked at Silas not as a man looks at an enemy, but as a judge looks at a ledger that will not balance. The Duke gestured toward Caleb, who sat on a crate, his face a map of bruises and dried blood, his fingers still clutching the rusted handle of the fish-gutting knife. It was an image of absolute disparity, the pauper who had bled and the merchant who had bribed. Julian spoke, and the words fell like stones into a deep well. He commanded Silas to step forward, to look upon the boy he had hunted, and to acknowledge the debt that could never be repaid in coin. The merchant attempted to speak, his mouth working with the frantic, silent rhythm of a landed fish, but the words died in his throat under the Duke's frozen gaze. With a sharp, sudden movement, Julian compelled the man to his knees. It was a social execution, absolute and final. The merchant was forced to offer a formal, groveling apology to the orphan of the docks, a humiliation that stripped Silas of his carefully cultivated, standing more effectively than any prison cell could ever achieve. Only when the merchant's forehead touched the dusty floor did Julian signal for Captain Marcus Sterling to lead the man away. Silas was not merely being arrested for harassment. He was being excised from the very ledger of the society he had tried so desperately to climb. When the room was finally clear of the merchant's presence, Julian turned his attention to Caleb. The Duke's grey eyes, usually as impenetrable as storm-tossed slate, softened with a recognition that was both heavy and sincere. He did not offer the boy a bag of gold, for such a gesture would have been a common transaction, an insult to the life Caleb had nearly forfeited. Instead, Julian spoke of a place at the Valerius ancestral estate, Aethelgard. He offered Caleb the position of a squire, a path toward a life of dignity, learning, and the protection of a name that signified something more than mere survival. It was a summons to step from the penumbra of the unseen into the light of a house that finally knew how to breathe again. Aethelgard did not merely receive guests. It observed them with the stately patience of ancient stone and polished mahogany. In the weeks that followed the events at the clock tower, the house seemed to shed its winter coat of grief, the silence no longer possessing the sharp teeth of a tomb. Caleb Thorne, now scrubbed clean of the city's grime and dressed in the understated livery of the ducal household, moved through the corridors with a spine that had learned the habit of being straight. His transition was not a cinematic miracle, but a slow, scrupulous process of unlearning the instincts of the hunted. He no longer flinched at the sound of a closing door, and the constant gnawing creditor of hunger had finally been declared bankrupt. On a quiet afternoon, as the scent of beeswax and the first hint of early lilacs drifted through the library, Caleb sat across from the Dowager Duchess. He had become a constant presence in her rooms, an intellectual ward whose sharp mind and raw integrity she nurtured with the same care she gave to her prized gardens. Upon the desk between them sat a small, exquisite object, the velvet reliquary. It was a box of deep crimson, lined with the finest silk, and inside it lay the rusted, bone-handled fish-gutting knife and a single dried crust of rye bread. Caleb reached out and touched the cold metal of the blade. It was his anchor. He had insisted on keeping these remnants of his past, not as trophies of his ascent, but as a scrupulous ledger of his soul. Every morning, he looked upon the knife to ensure that he never became like the merchants of the market square, men who saw only the mud on their boots and never the persimmon standing within them. He understood now that his poverty had been a crucible, and the integrity he had forged within it was the only currency that truly mattered in the halls of power. He was no longer the penniless orphan. He was the conscience of the house. Eleanor watched him with a mixture of pity and immense maternal pride. She reached across the desk and placed her hand over his, her touch as warm as the hearth fire. She told him that while the world might perceive an orphan rescued by a duchess, she saw a woman who had been preserved by the grace of a king. The title of orphan had been lifted from his shoulders, replaced by a belonging that was not born of blood, but of a shared recognition of worth. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the library floor, the Valerius estate felt settled, its ledgers finally solvent. The house was no longer holding its breath. It was living, and for the first time in his life, Caleb Thorne was home. Have you ever felt truly seen by someone who owed you nothing? Or perhaps you have been the one to recognize the hidden gold in a person the world chose to ignore. Let me know where you are listening from tonight, and may your own house be a sanctuary of warmth and integrity. Good night from the fireside.